So, first of all, welcome, Murad. Welcome back to the channel.
I am very happy to be here once again.
I've a few announcements to make before we continue. First of all, for those who are looking for the old videos, they're all backed up on the Rumble and Odyssey channels. So I will share links to those later. So the old Sneakers Corner channel has been closed for private reasons. Hopefully, I won't have to do that again. The second thing I want to mention is in relation to Paul Ellis. He's preparing some presentations for later. There's a couple of things he wants to talk about. One would be the coins, and the other one would be the early dating to Mecca. I have no idea what he has in store in relation to that. And the other one is in relation to the current series I'm doing in terms of Syriac and Ethiopic sources. The next two episodes are going to be quite meaty. They are in relation to St. Ephraim's hymns and whether they could be construed as having sexual connotations. And there's an argument to be had on both sides of the fence on this one. On one side, we have the scholar Tor Andre, and on the other side, we have Dom Beck and Christoph Luxemburg. So that will be an interesting one. As I go through the evidence, I keep flipping my opinion on this. I think I've settled somewhere between the two extremes. So that'll be coming up shortly. And what was the other issue I wanted to bring up? Yes, in the follow-up episode, I'll be taking excerpts from St. Ephraim's hymns. So it'll be good to actually look at what the hymns have to say and see if we can see any parallel in the Quran. So that's coming up. Murad, have you got anything that you want to share with anyone here?
Well, as the people know, I am currently translating the Quran, so I am really just sitting around with the Quran and always finding new things and new surprises. And what I can tell you is that this translation is gonna be unique because no translation ever uh, started from scratch like this. I did not read any other translation, and I'm not influenced by any other translation. So I don't know how this will influence the works of other people in the future. It could strengthen some theories and weaken other theories. So it's going to be a very important work.
Yeah. Just on that, actually, it's not entirely disconnected. I was thinking the other day about how could you convey the idea that there's variance in the early Arabic Qurans, and one way I was thinking is if you could convert all of the lettering and the diacriticals into a musical note, and then take a particular verse and then play it as a piece of music, you could actually hear the differences between the different versions. What do you think of that as a concept?
Well, you see, when I translate, I look at the text without the diacritical marks. There is a website that just offers that because it is people who have written the Quran in a very easy way, like we write it today without the diacritical marks. So it is easy to see what this word means, and then I look at it in the Hafs and I see how he twisted it a little bit here or a little bit there.
Yeah,
So the root word is the same. It did not change, but the Hafs uh, and the other readers are the ones who made this change. But the changes are not big.
yeah,
Like, is it come down or is it slowly come down or continuously come down?
yeah,
These are
yeah,
the subtle differences.
yeah. I suppose it only becomes relevant when the question is if um, if a Muslim says that it's perfectly preserved, which is very high standard, and when you look and see there are variants, which of course they deny, then
Well,
it
I can
can't be
say,
perfectly preserved.
yeah, I don't remember who is the historian who said this, but it is near perfect preserved if the criteria is that um, it didn't change much the skeletal text. But
Yeah.
if you wanna include the diacritical marks and the dots, then you are crazy. But it is it's good preserved. Just
The skeleton.
yeah, on a skeletal level, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but not bad.
Yeah. So you think there were actually skeleton changes as well as diacritical changes?
Yeah, the skeletal changes are not that much
Yeah.
because in my translation also the word, let's say the word qatala and qital, there
Yeah.
is an alif, there is this dagger alif, but actually it's the same word. You remember J. Smith? He says, "I want to know, was the prophet killed or was the prophet just fighting?"
Yeah.
And what I would say is that there is no big difference because either he is killed or he was battled against in order to die. It's the
Yeah.
same word in the end.
Yeah. Brilliant.
But
So
there is no good English equivalent for qital. The only word would be combat. Combat
yeah.
in order to kill.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. The idea today is we're going to look at a video together and we'll give our thoughts on this video. And it's titled "Who Wrote the Quran?" It's had 1.3 million viewers, so it's a popular one. And I suppose the question is it an accurate video, really? I'm sure we'll probably have lots of positive things to say about it. We may have a few negative things. And I invite our viewers to leave comments below this video in terms of what you think of the content of the video. But definitely, I think, as we'll see, the visuals of it are excellent. I wish I could do the visuals as good as the producer of the video, but maybe I will someday. So here we go. Are you ready?
Yes.
So let's go for it. Okay.
In which I explored the topic from a strictly historical
Let's try it again.
point of view. This led to comments from many people. Hi, this is Matt Baker. I recently completed a series
I think we have a little bit of a lag, but let's give it another
on this
go.
channel called Who Wrote the Bible, in which I explored the topic from a strictly historical point of view. This led to comments from many people asking me to do something similar for the Qur'an. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do in this video. However, keep in mind that the
I'm going to stop it there for a second. I think it's lagging a lot. So what I'll do is I'll share the video that is online. It might work better. What do you think? Might be an idea.
Yeah,
Okay,
no
so
problem.
okay, let's try that. Sorry, everyone. I think the internet is not the best here, but let's see if this works. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Now, do I need to change anything? Is it going to play for us? Okay, here we go. Let me know if it's playing okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's doing. No, is that okay? Yeah, good.
Yeah, I see.
Right here. All right, let's. Okay.
Baker. I recently completed a series on this channel called Who Wrote the Bible, in which I explored the topic from a strictly historical point of view. This led to comments from many people asking me to do something similar for the Quran. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do in this video. However, keep in mind that the Bible and the Quran are two very different books, both from an academic perspective as well as from a theological perspective. So that's going to make things things, how can I say this, a bit tricky. First of all, you have to understand that the Quran is not simply the Muslim equivalent of the Bible. If you want to make a more accurate comparison, it would be better to say that the Quran is the Muslim equivalent of Jesus. Here's what I mean by that. Both groups believe that God revealed himself to humans in many different ways during ancient times. However, Christians believe that God chose to reveal himself in a final, universal way through Jesus. Not through the New Testament, but through the person of Jesus. So, for Christians, the Bible is not the ultimate revelation. It is simply the story of the ultimate revelation. While Muslims also believe that God chose to reveal himself in a final, universal way, but not through Jesus. For them, Jesus was just another human prophet, as was Muhammad. Muslims believe that the final universal revelation was not a person, but rather a written text, the Qur'an. So for Christians, the Bible is important, but it is not as important as Jesus. For Muslims, it's the reverse. Muhammad is important, but he is not as important as the Quran. What about Jews then? Isn't the Torah the Jewish version of God's final universal revelation? Well, no, because for us Jews, there is no such thing as a universal revelation. According to Judaism, the Torah was meant for the Jewish people only, not for all of humankind. So Jews don't actually have anything that's the equivalent of either Jesus or the Quran. Now, there's another major difference between the Bible and the Quran that must be made clear. This chart represents various ways in which a religious text can be viewed, ranging from 100% divine authorship to 100% human authorship. For Muslims, the Quran is all the way over here. They believe that their holy book was literally dictated to the Prophet Muhammad, word for word, by God, via the angel Gabriel. Very few Christians or Jews view their scriptures in this way. Although a very small minority believe something along those lines, the vast majority would simply say that their holy books were inspired by God, meaning that both God and human authors played a role. Now, when it comes to how big of a role that God played versus how big of a role that the human authors played, there are several different positions. Some lean towards inerrancy, meaning that although humans wrote the books in their own unique styles, God made sure that they contained absolutely no errors, whether scientific or historical. Others lean more towards infallibility, meaning that while the Bible's overall message is trustworthy on matters of faith and religious practice, the authors were obviously limited by the scientific and historical understandings of their time. Now, even though I am a Jew and also a theist, I would actually place all works of religious literature all the way over here. But I would like to make it clear that my position is a minority one. Most Jews and Christians would fit into the inerrancy or infallibility categories, with the more conservative types leaning towards inerrancy and the more liberal types leaning towards infallibility.
Okay, so what do you make of all that? Is there a serious consequence if Muslims consider the Quran to be 100% authored by Allah? What do you think, Murad?
Well, as someone who is translating the Quran, I can tell you that who is speaking is a narrator. It's not really Allah, it's a narrator, because it says, then Allah said, all over the place. So this is not the word of Allah, this is the word of a narrator. And in some places in the Quran, it seems like this narrator is speaking about himself.
Yeah. I think Muslims have boxed themselves in a corner on this one, because once you take the position that it's 100% written by God, and then you see errors in it, you see scientific errors, you see the footprints of a human authorship in the book, it's very hard to defend that, especially when we can point to sources like, for example, the Syriac sources. We can point to the use of not just religious texts, but also secular texts. I think then you have a major problem. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, but the main idea I see is that the Quran is written maybe a little similar to the Bible. It's an author who is narrating the events and talking about how God interjects in some point. So, yes, the Muslims say that is the word of God. They can say that all they want, but when you read it, it comes from someone who is just narrating. And in the Quran, there is a verse which says, أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهُ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا. It's like, should I seek other than God as a judge? And this is not the word of Allah, this is the word of someone speaking.
Yeah.
I want to just say something before, when we continue, is that you should make the resolution of the video much lower, because it's lagging.
Yeah, I realized that. I think the reason I had two versions of the live studio open, that's, I think once I've closed on one, the lagging seems to have stopped. But unfortunately, I can't change the settings. Let me just double check, just to be sure here. Yeah, it's grayed out while we're live. Unfortunately, can't change it. So hopefully it will be okay. All right. But apologies for all the technical problems. I hopefully will learn from this. It will be better next time. Okay.
Yeah, actually, the live that we are on now is not the same as the event that people tuned in the beginning. So I went to the other one and told the people to join here.
Yeah.
That's why we have a few people. So everyone on this live stream, for this mistake, please go to the other live stream, which is the original one, and write in the live chat for people to come here. Give them the link.
Yeah. Okay. So let's continue. Let's see if we can get. Oh, if it's this one here, let's try it here. Share screen. Sorry.
However, the main point I want to make through all of this is that the Muslim view of the Quran is very different than the average Christian or Jew's view of the Bible. Therefore, if you're a Muslim, the answer to the question, who wrote the Quran, is pretty straightforward. Allah, aka God, wrote the Quran. Sure, Allah may have revealed it through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, but neither Gabriel nor Muhammad is its ultimate author. God is the ultimate author of the Quran, and God alone. This is something that, for Muslims, must be taken on faith. So, if that's what you believe, and if you're likely to be offended by hearing any alternative theories, you should stop watching this video now. However, if you're wondering how secular academics might answer the question, or how people from other religions might answer the question, feel free to keep watching. Okay, so the next thing you need to know is that unfortunately, very little research has been done on the Quran from a textual criticism perspective. When it comes to the Bible, we've got lots of research going back hundreds of years. But when it comes to the Quran, not so much. Therefore, keep in mind that everything I'm going to discuss from this point forward is far more tentative and hypothetical than what I discussed in the Bible episodes. But before we get into the possible sources for the Quran and who compiled them, I want to tell you a little bit about how the Quran is arranged. Unlike the Bible, which is divided into many different books, the Quran is really just one book. It does have divisions called surahs, but surahs are more like chapters, not separate books. There are 114 of them in total, and they are arranged not thematically or chronologically, but simply by length. Aside from the very first surah, which is kind of a preface, the longest chapter is placed at the very beginning, and then it pretty much goes by size, with the shortest chapters coming at the end. The only other major way to divide the Quran is by dividing it into the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs. According to tradition, Muhammad and his followers initially lived in Mecca, but then in the year 622 CE, they moved to Medina. So some surahs were revealed to him in the first location, whereas others were revealed in the second location. Most Islamic scholars tend to agree on which ones are which, and in fact, there is even a generally agreed upon list in which every surah is ordered from first to last. So, for example, chapter 96, called Al-Alaq, is considered to have been the first revelation. Traditionally, this event is dated to the year 609 CE. On the other hand, chapter 110, called An-Nasr, is considered to have been the last revelation, being given to Muhammad in the year 632, just a few months before he died. Now, according to tradition, Muhammad was illiterate, and therefore he shared his revelations orally only. His various companions either memorized them or wrote parts of them down. Therefore, by the time Muhammad died, there was not yet a complete written version of the Quran.
Okay, so let's go back there. Any thoughts on that so far?
I would like to hear what do you think first.
Okay, well, I thought he's pretty much repeating, the standard Islamic narrative on the idea of the Meccan and Medinan surahs. It's my understanding that these are kind of spurious categorizations of the different surahs. And it's a convenient story because it hides the fact that some of the surahs have a clear connection with the Syriac hymns, for example. And by claiming that the difference in style is due to, this was when Muhammad was in Mecca and this is when he was in Medina, it's a handy story to tell the audience in terms of why there's a clear difference in terms of style. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs, he acts as if this is something that we are so sure of. But actually, within the Islamic tradition and the books, it's not clear. Like, you can have multiple opinions about what's a Meccan surah and what's a Medinan surah. So this is not like 100% clear. And the idea itself is stupid because there are a lot of verses that is supposedly started in Mecca and ended in Medina. So if I say, let's go out for a coffee, it's like I said, let's go out in Mecca, and then in Medina I said for a coffee. This is stupid.
Yeah.
So this whole idea is just to cement the idea that Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina. It's just another hoax.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, as Hegel has said, isn't he still talking about what Muslims believe? I think he is. He's not questioning it all that much. He's basically, this is the standard version, but this standard version is repeated by an awful lot of scholars, and it's just accepted without any major questioning. So I would say even this needs to be questioned, even if we're just repeating what Muslims believe. So okay, so let's go back.
Yeah.
Most Muslims believe that this occurred during the reign of the Caliph Uthman, approximately 20 years after the death of Muhammad. According to Sunni tradition, it was Uthman who created the first standardized version of the Quran, ordering all variant copies to be destroyed. Now, among secular historians, there is some disagreement on how best to understand these early years of Islam. Some secular historians basically accept the traditional narrative, except for the part about the revelations being from God. According to this view, Muhammad was the primary author of the Quran, regardless of whether he shared the content orally or in a written format. On the other hand, other secular historians question whether or not anything from the first 150 years of Islamic history can be trusted. They argue that everything we know about this period comes entirely from sources written much later, during the Islamic Golden Age, and therefore they see the stories about Islam's initial conquests as being more legendary in nature. According to this scenario, the Quran was probably a document that evolved more slowly, with several people having a hand in its production. Personally, I lean more towards accepting the traditional narrative. Again, except for the divine revelation part. This is because we do have several non-Islamic references to the Prophet Muhammad that date to just a few years after his death. We also have a partial manuscript of the Quran, known as the Sana'a manuscript, that dates to around the year 670.
Okay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, having Muhammad being mentioned is not a 100% proof that he wrote the Quran. There is no correlation. And having the Sana'a manuscript doesn't prove Muhammad. They are two disconnected things. And why is he connecting them? Because he is still inside the standard Islamic narrative.
Exactly.
And
That's
even mentioning Muhammad, I think it's not mentioned by name. This is another leap of faith.
Yeah. I think there's also the whole issue of, the standard or the standardized Quran under Uthman. Do we know this? Any of this is true? Where are these copies? We haven't got a single copy of these so-called Uthmanic text. All we have is the claim again, and the claim is made many centuries later. So the other question is, if you had a Quran that was supposedly standardized in the middle of the 7th century, then why did they mess with it? Why would they change it? Why not just keep it as is, if having a standard version is so important?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's go back. We'll go from there.
This indicates that the Quran can be traced back very close to Muhammad's lifetime. However, something else that the Sana'a manuscript seems to indicate, though, is that there were probably several slightly different versions of the Quran in existence during the early years of Islam. If you want to learn more about the Sana'a manuscript, Al-Muqaddimah just released a video about it today, so be sure to check it out. I'll leave a link at the end of this video. The final thing I want to address is the sources that were used by Muhammad in the creation of the Quran. Obviously, for a Muslim, there is no such thing as the sources for the Quran. There is only one source, and that source is Allah. But for a secular historian, Muhammad must have gotten his material from somewhere. So, from where did he get it? The important thing to remember here is that Muhammad lived in a world in which Judaism and Christianity looked quite a bit different than they do today. A lot.
I'm going to stop there for a second. My initial reaction to that is in his mind, according to the standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad has awareness in way down in Mecca of all of these Syriac sources, but that's highly unlikely in a desert area where there's no cultural interaction between it and a Syriac population, which you would typically find up north. Any thoughts on that part of it?
Yeah, just the idea that Muhammad came up with the Quran is itself a leap of faith. It doesn't cross his mind that maybe there is a different scenario. But if you ask him about Jesus, I don't know the guy, but I'm sure if you ask him about Jesus, he will give you every sort of crazy theory out there. Like he will know that maybe Jesus was a magic mushroom. He will know that maybe, yes, and this was a big theory that Jesus was a magic mushroom, and these people they had shrooms and started hallucinating. But when it comes to Islam, he doesn't look at any other theory that might really have solid ground.
Yeah.
Like Muhammad, why did he assume that he write the Quran very easily like that? That's a question.
Yeah, I think he goes further than some scholars might, but he doesn't go far enough. Is where I probably lean towards. Okay, so
Yeah, and he is doing good work. Like he is asking a good question, but he should ask more questions.
yeah. Okay, let's go from there.
A lot of people assume that when Muhammad showed up, there were people called Jews, there were people called Christians, and then there were now people called Muslims. 3 nice, neatly divided groups. But this was not the case. For example, the Talmud, which would go on to become the authoritative text for rabbinical Judaism, was only recently completed. It was finished around the year 500 CE, just 70 years before the birth of Muhammad. So there was likely still quite a bit of diversity among Jews, especially in faraway places such as southern Arabia and Ethiopia. And the same was true of Christianity. As I mentioned in my video on the Gospels, there were initially many different Christianities, and it took many centuries before the dominant version stamped out all the other versions, which it considered to be heresies. Remember, although it started in the 1st century CE, Christianity didn't really take off until the 4th century CE, when it became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. It would thus have been around the 4th and 5th centuries, not too long before Muhammad, that the so-called heretical versions of Christianity might have shifted to places outside of Roman influence. Places like, Arabia. In other words, it's not hard to imagine that Muhammad would have come into contact with various different types of Christians and Jews, and that the types of Christians and Jews that he came into contact with were the ones that were outside of the mainstream.
What do you make of that part? I think he's on to stronger ground there, apart from the Muhammad aspect.
Yeah, he makes a very big jump that actually the Arabian atheists make here, is that they show you the Nazarenes and the Collyridians, and then they say, well, Muhammad, he stole these things from them. But the main question that should be asked is that where do you find these people in Arabia? Like, do you find the Collyridians in Arabia? Do you find the Nazarenes in Arabia? They say, well, Waraq ibn Nawfal who was a relative of Khadija. He was a Nazarene or an Ebionite. How did you know? This is the $1 million question, because if you know this, then life would be much easier.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a massive jump. It's really comes down to where would someone or a group of people make contact with these different ideas and groups, and I think the bit that's missing really they doesn't get. He's assuming it's down in Mecca because that's the standard Islamic narrative, but he's not actually going, well, the most obvious place would be way up north. Yemen is still a possibility. You know, there is enough of a community down there for that to be possible, but certainly not in the
But
middle of the desert.
he doesn't even say Mecca. He just says Arabia. He makes
Yeah,
it very easy, as if all these people they were just there in Arabia, and
yeah,
Muhammad just stole everything and life is easy. Well, it's not this way at all. And
yeah,
you are digging into this stuff, and you know that maybe very hardly you will find this Collyridian heresy, maybe in Harran, which is very, very far off. Or
yeah,
maybe you will find some Ebionite heresies, and even we do not have their gospel. They would say, well, it's the gospel of Mark, but without, or maybe it's the gospel of Matthew, but without the genealogies. This is not 100% proven.
yeah.
So it's not that easy.
Yeah. I got a good question here from Rochelle Charles. To both of you, would it be fair to say Muhammad or whoever he was had no connection to the Quran? Can I respond to that first,
Yeah,
initially?
yeah.
I would go along with Odin Lafontaine's approach, which is the idea that we have like a group of preachers who are involved in a missionary work of some kind, and it's their communications that are what we get in terms of the Quran. So it's not down to one person; it's a group effort, and they have some connection with the Quran, at least a core part of it, which was added upon and edited over the decades after that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Quran is not connected to Muhammad. Like
Yeah,
it's written a little bit after, like not
yeah,
too much after, but it's written from memory
yeah,
by a group of people afterwards. And
hmm,
this group of people is small, a handful of people. And remember, as I'm translating the Quran now, I've read it multiple times before I speak with the people on the internet. I've never read it from A to Z, but now I know it very much. I know the details of it. So I see like two hands, I see like two authors.
yeah,
One is more poetic, and one is a little on the aggressive side and
yeah,
doesn't really care about poetry. So
yeah,
minimum two authors.
yeah. There's a follow-up question there from Rich. Or could the Quran have been debate papers based on your Iraqi thesis? Certainly, some form of dialogue maybe is going on, and that's what we're seeing. I would suggest reading the what's called the what is Odin's paper called? The Great Secret of Islam. Is that what it's called? I can't remember. I think
I
it's
think
called.
so, yes.
Yeah. There's a lot in that. I don't know if we've really done that thesis enough justice yet. There's an awful lot in it, and I don't know how many of you have read it. And but I know there was a question of whether it got translated fully in English yet. I'm not sure what the latest. I read a draft version of the translation, but I think it's the best thesis out there at the minute for where the Quran came from. But okay, let's continue with the video.
Yeah.
Okay.
For example, there once existed a group called the Ebionites that fit somewhere in between Judaism and Christianity. On the one hand, they accepted Jesus as an important prophet and saw him as being the Messiah. But on the other hand, they rejected his divinity and continued to follow Jewish laws, such as not eating pork. Sounds a lot like Islam to me. As far as we know, the Ebionites had mostly disappeared by the time that Muhammad came onto the scene. However, there were likely still groups around that had been influenced by them, groups that then perhaps went on to influence Muhammad. So now that you understand the general situation, let's get down to some specifics. If you're familiar with the Bible and then start to read the Qur'an, you'll definitely notice some similarities. Many of the same characters show up, and even some of the same stories are told. However, some of the stories are quite different. For example, sometimes there is information missing, and other times there is information added. If you watch our video about the Islamic Prophet's family tree, which I'll link to in the description, you can find out more about what these similarities and differences are. One thing that is clear is that Muhammad did not copy directly from the Bible. In other words, there are no sections of the Quran where the text matches perfectly with text from the Bible. It's more like he heard someone summarize a biblical story, and then he in turn summarized it using his own words. But what about all the extra information, the various details that are not found anywhere in the Bible? Well, let's look at several examples. The first is a story about Abraham. In the Quran, in Surah 21, Abraham smashes his father's idols during his youth in Babylon, and then is thrown into a fire by the king as a punishment. But God saves him, and he survives unharmed. Now, although this story is not found in the Bible, it is in fact found in a text that predates the Quran. It comes from a commentary on the book of Genesis written by a rabbi sometime between 300 and 500 CE. So it's certainly possible that Muhammad was familiar with the story. Another example is a story about Mary, mother of Jesus. In the Quran, in Surah 19, Mary comes across a palm tree while she is pregnant. In order to feed his mother, Jesus performs a miracle from within the womb, causing figs to fall from the tree when shaken. Again, this story is not found in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. However, as I mentioned in my episode about the Gospels, there were actually many other Gospels, ones that did not make it into the New Testament. One of these is known as Pseudo-Matthew. In Pseudo-Matthew, a very similar story is told about Mary and the palm tree. The only difference is that in Pseudo-Matthew, the palm tree actually bends its branches so that Mary can reach the figs. Now, Pseudo-Matthew was written around the same time as Muhammad lived, but in a very different location. So I think it's unlikely that Muhammad got the story directly from Pseudo-Matthew, or that Pseudo-Matthew got it directly from Muhammad. What's more likely is that this was simply a well-known story that was floating around at the time, and that both authors were familiar with it. My third example...
Any thoughts on that?
Well, I want to tell you something very interesting about the word khinzir. Because you mentioned that the Quran is very similar and it says that don't eat the flesh of the pigs. But do you know what the word khinzir means in just in the Arabic dictionary?
No idea.
It doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean a pig. It could mean decaying flesh or carrion, like flesh with very bad odor that's corrupted.
Like a roadkill type situation.
Yeah, so yes, I do believe that the Quran is talking about the pigs because it comes from the Torah. But I don't like that someone would be 100% sure of something that he doesn't know the language about. And
Yeah.
the other thing is that he makes a good connection, of course, with Mary and the palm tree and all of that, but then he jumps quickly to a conclusion. He says that it's very likely that people just knew these stories and rehashed them. Again, he doesn't have good evidence as to how these stories got into the Quran.
No,
Like,
and he
what
basically...
are we doing for years? We are trying to see how these stories came about, and he's just like fixing it very quickly without any proof. That's the idea.
Yeah, he kind of says, well, he assumes Muhammad lived in Mecca, or he doesn't mention it directly, but he assumes that, and so therefore he's in the wrong location, so he couldn't have read it. But it must have been popular, so therefore he picked it up that way. But there's so many assumptions there. An easier approach would be that people writing the Quran were literate, for one thing, and were in a location where access to these sources was easy enough. The other thing I think I would kind of question is when he talks about the Quranic versions of the stories of the Bible, the kind of rewordings, the allusions to it. He doesn't seem to make the connection that this would suggest that the Quran was written in a location where people were already familiar with the biblical story, so they don't need to retell the story. They could get away with a paraphrase of the story and maybe add a few details, but that's more suggestive of a location where you have Christians or Jews familiar with the stories, which wouldn't be in the Arabia Deserta, the deserted, uninhabited part of Arabia. It'd be more typical somewhere like the Jordan areas, Syria, Iraq, or maybe Yemen, but not like in the middle of nowhere. Any other thoughts before we move on?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Is the story of the sleepers in the cave. In the Quran, in Surah 18, it tells a story about some men who were being persecuted for beliefs. They take refuge in a cave where God causes them to go into a deep sleep, one that miraculously lasts over 300 years. They therefore end up escaping the persecution. This story is actually a well-known Christian legend that appears in multiple sources predating the Quran, the earliest one being that of the Syrian poet Jacob of Syria. One more example. Later in the same surah, Surah 18, the Quran mentions a man called Dhul Qarnayn, a phrase that literally means the two-horned one. According to the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn travels to the east to a mountainous region where a group of people are being persecuted by two evil nations, known as Gog and Magog. He helps them by building a giant wall to keep Gog and Magog at bay. This story is very similar to a well-known legend about Alexander the Great that was very common in ancient times. In fact, Alexander the Great was often depicted as having horns, hence the name Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one. What all of these examples show is that the Quran includes many stories that can be found in other texts that existed at the time when it was created. So not only did the Quran use the Bible as a source, it also used Jewish commentaries, Christian apocryphal literature, and even sources that contain stories about pagan heroes. In other words, the Quran was very much a product of its time. Let me put it this way. If a person were to go back in a time machine to the Middle East in the year 600 CE and randomly collect a bunch of stories that were popular at the time, that collection would likely look very similar to the contents of the Quran. Of course, the Quran also includes commentary on those stories and theological lessons, so even if one doesn't see the Quran as being a word-for-word miracle sent from God, one can still see it as containing valuable insight. Now,
I think one of the things I would bring out there is the fact that there's clear evidence there that there's literary sources rather than oral sources being referenced in the Quran, and yet he doesn't make that leap to the idea that, well, maybe the authors here are literary rather than illiterate, or illiterate even. What do you think on that score?
Yeah, but I think this last conclusion that we have heard is good. Like, I don't have a big problem with what he said, how the Quran is actually composed of biblical text, Jewish apocrypha, and all this stuff. But like, he is not really looking into the nature of these authors. These authors, I think Paul Ellis would be the one who really like represents my view when it comes to the Quran. He's the closest to my view. Is that these people, they are not silly people. They
Yeah.
are very heavyweight. The Quran is very heavyweight, and it goes into very Jewish details. And even read Judaism, he says the same thing. It goes into very Jewish details that was not easy for someone to access. Like you
Yeah.
cannot access this Talmudic. Like it's not like that anyone could get access to the Talmud.
So you're
So
saying essentially, without putting words in your mouth, that it's unlikely that an illiterate person would have access to this material.
no. Especially in these days. I mean, in
Yeah.
those days, this is not something that's easy. You have to
Yeah.
be like a sage or something
Yeah.
to get access to something like this.
Yeah.
So they're not silly people, but they were a bunch of people. They're not Muhammad.
Like, who are the sort of people that would have access to the libraries with all this material, or would even access to a library with this material be enough? Would you need to be mentored into this material?
Well, it's either a Jew or it's someone that's a friend of a Jew.
Yeah.
Because how will you get access to the Babylonian Talmud or the Yerushalmi or Jerusalem Talmud? And how will you make these connections?
Yeah.
Very difficult.
And like, you're talking, what? How many years of training would you require to kind of get this
But
sort of level of knowledge? Like years, I
the
presume.
words, yeah, but the words of Sibius, they always ring in my ear
Yeah.
when it says that Muhammad was very knowledgeable of the Jewish scripture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good connection.
So maybe Muhammad, he was that guy. But now we are not talking about a bloodthirsty warlord. We are more talking about someone who is a sage and he knows exactly what he's talking about. So this gives a totally different description of what we imagine.
Yeah.
So
He's
how will we know? This will come with time as we see more sources.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say we're talking about someone who today you'd call him a theologian, maybe someone who's
Yeah,
into the scripture and
and
trying
of
to make
high
sense of?
standard, and of high standard.
Yeah. And do you think the distortions that were made in terms of the reading of diacritical marks has done harm in terms of seeing the genius behind it, or
Yeah,
you
of
think that?
course.
Yeah.
Like when I finish the not this translation, but the future one, which will have the Jewish layer, the biblical layer, the Aramaic, the Hebrew, all this stuff, and removing the diacritical marks, and this will give you like a much better perspective of what's going on. Like you will get much closer to the reality of it.
Yeah. I've got a comment here from Rishel. Red Judaism has been posting a lot of brilliant content regarding the borrowed prayers and other influences. Do you plan to get him on and talk about it?
Me in the future, yes,
Yeah.
but currently I am collaborating only on a very small scale because I'm putting all the focus on translating the Quran. But once this is out, I will collaborate with a lot of people. And the expertise of Red Judaism is one of the best ever
Yeah.
on the internet.
Yeah.
So of
Yeah.
course I will get with him
Yeah.
in the future. Yeah.
We can't overlook the Jewish aspect on this. And you do need a Jewish expert to be able to really engage with this material, because you kind of have to have the inside scoop on this, otherwise you're going to miss so much. So yeah, he's very helpful, and we've on my previous channel I've had difficulties with him, but I'm always willing to put all of that aside, but that's in his court. But anyway, let's go back to the last part of the video.
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, one could argue that the reason why the Quran contains many stories that can be found in other literature of the time is that the Quran is in fact an accurate account of events, authored by the creator of the universe. Taken on faith, this is indeed a valid position. However, taken strictly on the principles of the historical method, it is not. There is a clear textual history that demonstrates how the various biblical stories developed over time. However, according to Muslims, the Bible is simply a corrupt version of several now lost texts, such as the Torah, the Zabur, and the Injil. If this were true, one would expect to find some sort of textual evidence for these older works. But as of yet, no such evidence has ever been found. Finally, I want to mention a hypothesis about the Quran that is very much just a hypothesis, meaning that it is definitely not the mainstream position, even among secular scholars. It is the one found in the 2000 book, The Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, by Christoph Luxemburg. In this book, Luxemburg uses linguistic arguments to claim that the Quran was heavily influenced by the Syriac language, a language that was spoken in Syria and much of the Middle East during the time of Muhammad. In particular, Syriac was used by early Christians, and therefore Luxemburg argues that certain sections of the Quran might be directly based on Syriac liturgies. Now, it might seem odd to claim that the most famous book written in Arabic is actually heavily based on a totally different language, in this case, Syriac. However, keep in mind that the Arabic of the Quran is in fact quite mysterious in parts. Because Arabic doesn't have vowels, there is always some room for debate on how to translate certain words. But again, let me remind you that this last hypothesis has yet to gain very much traction. Okay, so that was a look at the question, who wrote the Quran? And I'm happy to announce that I've decided to extend this series for at least one more episode. I've had several requests for a video on
Okay. I think one of the things I'd want to bring up there is this argument that the Bible was corrupted, which you often find in Islamic circles, but there's no evidence for this. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, there is no evidence in the Quran, and especially when I'm translating the word that يحرفون الكلم عن مواضعه. This is the word. Of course, I've looked deeply into it, into every single word. I will not crack it 100% now, but what I can tell you is the word kalim means the phrases. It's not words or verses or something like this. So just looking exactly into each word changes the things a little bit. And another thing is that the Quran doesn't claim to be Arabic. And this will be clear in my upcoming translation. Anyone could just type معنى عربي, meaning the meaning of Arabic, in the Arabic dictionary. It doesn't mean the Arabic language. It means something different, which is something much easier. So once you get this out of the way, then you will accept that the Quran has Syriac roots, Aramaic roots, because this is not a problem. Any language is influenced by older languages.
Like, I think one of the ideas that you came out before on this reference to this book is written in a clear Arabic. It actually meant something like it's written clearly rather than it's not actually specifying Arabic. Am I right?
Yeah, not exactly, but it's something along those lines. And the word Arabic is mentioned somewhere else in the Quran, and no one dares to translate it as Arabic. They say something else.
There's a question there from Carol B, or even a reaction. Luxembourg's idea hasn't gotten much traction according to the video. I think it's grown in traction. What do you think?
Of course, it has gotten much traction, and it was mentioned in a documentary. And the guy's work was in German. Then it got translated into English, and all of the so-called revisionist scholars they made comments about it. I think Patricia Krohn didn't really like his work. It says it's the work of an amateur. But I love amateurs because they are the ones who are innovators. And when I listen to this guy speak in Arabic, this is a guy who knows exactly what he's talking about. Heavyweight scholar. This is not an amateur.
Yeah.
This is very wrong.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the things that maybe was missing from Luxemburg's work, and it's no criticism of him, it would have been helpful if he found some of the passages in Saint Ephraim's and lined them up with passages he'd found in the Quran. Just that was a criticism that Griffiths makes in a paper that I'm currently covering in the series I'm doing at the minute. But I think that's not a major criticism. I think that's just because you can only do so much as a scholar. You focus in on one particular area, and then you follow up later.
well, remember there is a treasure of Syriac work that has never been translated.
Yeah.
So we need people to translate all this treasure, all this gold, and it will show you a lot of stuff about Islam and how Islam started. Like it's not like the work has been done. So when I find this stuff, because I don't know, of course, how to read Syriac, I'm copying what Luxemburg is saying, and I'm adding my flavor to it from my knowledge. But I need people who really know Syriac and Aramaic to actually translate this work into English. So this is very important.
Yeah, I think we might find passages from the Quran in the old Syriac hymns, the madrashes, as they're called. It's an interesting term, madrashe, which is a teaching hymn. And someone pointed out on the channel that midrash is similar. And then you have madrasa in Arabic, which is the Arabic school.
Yeah, if you want the most accurate translation would be a place of studying, because darasa means study. When you put this mad, then you have place of studying.
Yeah.
I know it's not a big difference, but I am looking into these differences because it's a big deal when you are translating.
Yeah. Mick says Peshitta is Syriac Aramaic. Maybe stuff taken from that, possibly.
Yeah. I think that the Quran borrows from the Peshitta, not which is actually Peshitta means in Arabic basita, meaning simple.
Yeah.
So when the Quran is borrowing, it's borrowing from Syriac Aramaic sources, from the biblical Hebraica, not from not from the what do you call it? The Old Testament of now, not this one.
Yeah. Actually, when the Quran is saying that this text is clear, is it possible they might be implying this text is simple, as in Peshitta? Hardly.
No. The word la raib, it doesn't mean no doubt. It means it's a variation of doubt.
Yeah.
Because everyone translates that book, there is no doubt in it. But it's not exactly like that.
Yeah. Another excellent question from Rishal. How is the population of Syriac speakers in the Middle East? Are they prevalent or minority? Tiny minority, I believe, and it's shrinking due to policies in many Arab countries to reduce the amount of Syriac speakers. There's been a very strong persecution of them from, I would say, the 8th century onwards. It's almost like a downward spiral of Aramaic speakers. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. A lot of persecution, and maybe deep down they know that the Syriac people, they have the key to unlocking the Quran.
Absolutely.
So you can't learn Syriac in Turkey. You can't.
Yeah.
It's a
That's
problem.
that's a smoking gun there. You know, the fact that they're suppressing it so much. You know, they have something to hide, I think.
Yeah, you're
Um,
not allowed to learn Syriac when it's just a language.
yeah. Yeah, it's crazy, really. Yeah. So, any final questions, everybody? We've reached the end of that video. Maybe we should maybe kind of give an overall take on the video. I think overall, I think it's not bad, but I think the person assumes an awful lot of the standard Islamic narrative. That would be my kind of thoughts on it.
Yeah, my personal thoughts is that it is much better than I thought, because if a Western person would make a video about the Quran 10 years ago, he will have much more standard Islamic narrative in his head. But this guy is trying at least to find new theories. But remember, me and you and the people watching, they know a lot more than just a normal person knows about Islam. So that's why we see that it's not a very good video. But for someone who knows nothing about Islam, this is a good video.
Yeah, yeah, it looks impressive, and like it's had 1.2 million views, which is incredible. You know, so it's just kind of it's a pity that people who are interested in this area, they will never see material like what we're producing. It's just there's an awful lot of filtering out of our sort of material, I think.
Yeah.
Let me just have a look at this comment here. Syriac was essentially the lingua franca. Not only the Orthodox used it, but the Manichaeans, Marcionites, the Jasonites, and Nestorians. Yeah, it pretty much was spoken across the land.
I want this question from Generation Z.
Okay, I'll come to that. Do you both think that the Umayyads believed in some sort of Islam, or could they have been Melkite Christians or some other group? It's hard to know what. I think Melkite Christians is a good possibility. I think there was a transition from whatever it was there before to what we have now.
Yeah, it's well, Muawiyah is a very important person. He was more Christian than we think, but still he was a monotheist. Like, he didn't like the cross, he didn't like the Trinity, but he was leaning towards Christians, and he built them some monuments and stuff.
Yeah.
But as we kept going on, especially after Abd al-Malik, things started to get more Islamic as we know it today.
Yeah. Do you want to take this question?
Yes, here Gent Z says, can yusalli mean blessing in Arabic? No. No. Blessing is barakah. And yusalli means to pray. So when the Quran says, Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusallu ala nabi, it means indeed God or Allah and His angels pray on the Prophet. Pray
Right.
upon the Prophet. Because I remember that David Wood and Muhammad Hijab, they kept saying, was it 2 or is it 4? It's on. Allah is on. What's wrong? You see?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe it's like when a priest puts his hand above your head and prays. Something like this.
Yeah. It's that would essentially mean being ordained. Like, a bishop would do that to ordain someone as a priest. So maybe are they expressing something on those lines?
Maybe
But then,
I can't really tell, but all I can say is that as a translator to the Quran, I have to be 100% transparent and just literally translate every word. Because if I'm not doing this, then I'm really not respecting the Western audience. And what I have found out is that actually no one, even sadly, even the Christian ones, they do not respect the Christian audience, the Western audience, and they stuff words that are not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the danger. And we have a comment here from Vilnius. Lots of suppression by YouTube, maybe Arab shareholders. I'd say there's a certain amount of that. Like it's easy to mess with the algorithm. I would have thought if need be. One Muslim was arguing for that with CP. I'm not sure what. Oh, with the Usali maybe.
Yeah.
And CP gave him good though. And it seems to be a different concept of prayer. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Carol. Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I want 2 or 3 questions to the people in here because we're gonna wrap up soon. So give us your best questions now.
Okay. Yeah. So this
Someone
waits
says,
for.
what about Elias?
Yeah.
You mean Elias or ES?
Ilyas, is it Ilyas ibn Kapisa? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I think with the timeline revision, this guy falls off.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think we went as far as we could with that. The problem is, and this is the frustrating thing, is nothing adds up. We try and make historical events fit the standard Islamic narrative. The problem is with the standard Islamic narrative is so wonky that you can't actually make things line up. Okay.
Yeah, and here Richelle is saying, and I want to ask Richelle, I don't know, are you a woman or a man? I'm just curious about the name. And this person is saying, does he play a role in your conception of Islam? Meaning yes. Well, yes was important for the Arabs, not for the Muslims.
Yeah.
So the victory, well, and Mel here, he remembers much more than I do because I'm just obsessed with the Quran now. But
Yeah.
I remember that yes, he won a battle against the Persians that made the Arabs triumph. And this could be like where it all started, that
Yeah.
made the Islamic faith later.
Yeah. If we, and an awful lot of this comes with caveats. All we can say is based on what's out there, what's in the sources, but then we don't know if the sources are correct. But that's that's the usual sort of thing. And Richelle says that he's a guy, so yeah. Let me see here. The Quran was written in Iraq. See Surah 286, the final prayer of the writer of the Quran. I wonder what that is in reference to. I don't have it offhand.
Maybe she's referencing to the last words. It seems like the words of human beings. It's the words of someone praying to God. This can't be God speaking, so
yeah,
maybe this is the reference.
yeah. Okay,
Here Richelle says,
this one.
how do you think the Abbasids got everyone on their bandwagon? I find it hard to believe that they all left their beliefs and subscribed to the new sin. Well, of course not. They didn't change like everything, but the whole Qibla issue was a big deal. And I think that you have to look at the final Umayyad Caliph also, because when I remember when I looked at his coins, the final one and the one before him, their coins looked almost 100% Abbasid. So it seems like these people, they were more Abbasid. And I remember also that I've read something that these people were actually the first Abbasids, these 2 final Umayyad kings. So it's a gradual evolution, you see. And remember, during the Abbasid times, it was like Iran today. you will say something different, you will lose your head.
Yeah.
So it's not that people accepted it because it's so convincing. It's just because they don't want to lose their head.
Yeah. And you don't want to leave any written material that could be traced back to you and, get killed over it, So unless maybe people risked writing something in a cave somewhere for future generations, but it's a bit of a risky one to speak up at that time.
Yeah, and things like fictional literature, like 1001 Nights, maybe these people, they try to tell you the reality within these works. Because, of course, if you know 1001 Nights has Harun al-Rashid, which is an Abbasid caliph. So I don't take this work lightly. You see?
Yeah. Another comment here. I don't think Buhari and tafsirs came from 9th century. They probably came in the 11th or 12th centuries. Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of the material came beginning the 14th and 15th century as well. So kind of gradually starts seeping through. And a bit like trying to deal with cracks in a wall, they kind of plastered over with more hadiths as time went on. There's a comment here. What about Imam Malik's Muwatta? Is that one you can answer?
Well, I look at Bukhari and I don't really look at the other ones because it's all the same. Like once Bukhari is debunked, then all the others are the same. So you have Imam Malik and you have Muslim and you have all these people. So it will be just the same thing. I think these were writings that were later attributed to someone called Al-Bukhari and later attributed to someone called Malik. So even these works are a fraud.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. What about let me just have a look at this one. The Penny Dreadful. What about the Magazi Corpus? I have no idea.
I didn't look into it. You see, I am interested in Muhammad and the Quran and the early history of Islam only.
Yeah.
When you come to a later stage like this, then you go to Lloyd Dijon.
Yeah.
But I personally don't know about Al-Maghazi, Sharia, all this stuff. I don't like this.
For me, it's the fantasy layer. You're dealing with so much that's just nonsense, and you can't really do anything with it. Let me see. See if we've missed anything. This one, I think. He became a teacher and a judge and religious teacher today. Muhammad is a myth. Okay. Oh, okay. Another comment here. Magazi Corpus is the earliest. Well, as far as we can tell, I don't know what haven't really looked into it. Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so too. And as for the Maghazi, I will look into this stuff just once I finish the Quran translation. I'm currently not looking into the early history of Islam. That's the idea.
Okay. Well, Murad, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. It's great to have you back. Don't want to put you on the spot, but some time ago we spoke about looking at the Turin Shroud. Would you be interested in coming on at some time in the future when time permits to discuss that?
No problem, but I will be more of a guest because I don't have any material ready for the Shroud of Turin.
Maybe a kind of reaction to
I
material.
have bombs. Yeah, I could react with you, but I have very strong stuff that I will show in the future regarding the Shroud Turin.
Yeah.
The Turin Shroud, sorry, which is scientific only.
Yeah.
Not religious.
Yeah, because I think that's obviously that's a topic that's very different to what we normally cover on each other channel, but it's kind of an area that's very, very interesting. I think that would be good to do. Some stage in the future, we'll organise that. What else do I need to say? Yeah, look forward to Paul Ellis coming in the future. Any non-Muslim sources from the 9th to 12th century? I think that's something I've... Just have a look. Any non-Muslim sources from the 9th to 12th centuries? I've tried to look at for sources prior to the 9th century, because once you get into the 9th and 12th, from my point of view, they just tend to repeat the standard Islamic narrative at that stage. What do you think?
Yeah, 9th century you get good chronicles that you can build a whole story of Islam. I think there are priests who have written chronicles. A Byzantine priest and other people. So yeah, from 9 to 12th century, you have good material, non-Muslim material about Islam.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Murad, for joining us today, Saint Murad. I don't know if you have any last thoughts, but thank you so much for coming on, and apologies again for the technical problems at the beginning of our broadcast. Hopefully this is a learning process and we don't make the same mistake again, or at least me. Restream is a new piece of software for me, so it's a kind of a learning curve, but I hope it didn't annoy the audience too much. So we will talk to you again very soon, and thank you again.
Yeah, last word is that I ask the people to subscribe to my channel, which is Saint Murad, and to subscribe to your channel, which is Islamic Origins, and to subscribe to my channel, which is on Rumble, because if YouTube screws up and closes my channel for any reason in the future, we don't want to make the same mistake that people have made before.
Yeah.
So subscribe to me on YouTube and on Rumble, Saint Murad, here and there. That's all, and thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, and I would, totally 100% back that. Do the same with mine as well. If I disappear, that's where you'll find me. So talk to you all very soon.